I popped into my office for a few minutes on this Sunday afternoon, and I decided I'd like to share a few words around suffering and the chronic illness journey. And this is something that's not talked about a lot. And often, even as integrative medicine practitioners, a lot of the information that's given out and that's available is regarding the technical side of chronic illness, whether it be some of the different inflammatory markers that get elevated in chronic inflammatory response syndrome, or the different tests that are available, or what the different supplements or medications, etc. are, or what other physical therapies can be used to treat a condition. But I just want to zone into the actual experience of the person who is suffering from the chronic illness, and really just looking and thinking a little bit about the suffering side of it particularly. And I think there's a number of reasons, firstly, that there is a tremendous amount of suffering on the chronic illness journey. And one of those is just the actual symptoms of the illness. But I want to say that in many cases, the actual symptoms of the chronic illness are only a small amount of the total suffering that one experiences with that illness. And I'll go into that a little bit more later. But another major part of it is simply not being understood and not being validated. And that happens in many ways, including from the medical world to a certain degree. If one is suffering from one of these more obscure disorders, let's say it's chronic inflammatory response syndrome, let's say it's some kind of Lyme-like illness, or chronic fatigue syndrome, one of the big problems is that a lot of different medicos and other professionals simply don't have a framework to understand and properly really recognize that condition. And therefore there's a certain amount of suffering that comes with just not being able to be understood by your treating physician. And it also goes way further than that, in that many family members struggle to also understand these chronic illnesses and the effect they have on someone. So, for instance, it's often said that someone who has a chronic inflammatory response syndrome will often look quite well, and to the outer world, it would seem that there's actually not much wrong with them. But in their inner world, they know that they're just not able to function at the same level that everyone else is, and that they live life with a certain amount of fatigue and brain fog and chronic pain, just getting through every day. But that may not be easily understandable to family members, to a partner, to employers, and therefore one may be at times accused of making it up or accentuating one's symptoms. And there's a certain amount of pain and suffering that simply goes along with that, not being able to be seen in terms of what one is really experiencing. And that's very real. And then thirdly, I really want to talk about another whole category of suffering on the chronic illness journey, and that relates to the narratives that we create around our illness. Now, what do I mean by a narrative? Well, a narrative, very simply, is like a story. And one thing about a story is that a story is simply a description. It's not necessarily an accurate portrayal of the truth or of the full extent of reality. It's a certain perspective, and it often accentuates certain parts of the situation. So some of the examples of narratives we may have around our chronic illness journey are, why me? Why did this happen to me? Or is this ever going to end? or this is just so difficult, or I'm missing out on so much of my life, and am I ever going to get better? And these kind of narratives, and often there's an even longer string of thoughts that go around each of these ideas. And the reason that there's a certain amount of suffering with having a narrative attached to an illness is that that narrative causes you to basically resist the illness in certain ways. And so wherever there's resistance, there tends to be an accentuation or an increasing in the amount of suffering that's actually going on. So for instance, if let's say you're experiencing a headache, and then on top of that headache, you've got a narrative saying that maybe this headache will never stop, and maybe I could even die from this headache. Then that thought also creates a level of resistance to the experience of the headache. And rather than just having the experience of that pain, it's actually amplified manyfold due to that narrative. So really, one little bit of homework, if this does describe you, and if you are suffering from the chronic illness journey, or you're on the chronic illness journey, is I want you to start thinking about some of your narratives that you have around your illness. And one really useful thing to do is get a journal or a notepad and start writing down all the different thoughts you have around your illness. Whether it be this is never going to end, whether it be this is an incurable condition, or whatever other narrative you have or other thoughts you have around this illness, just write it all down. And just at the end of all of that, just have a look at all of the thoughts and narratives that you have around that illness. And I want to just make it clear that narratives, and I'm repeating this again, that narratives around your illness are not the ultimate truth. And what I want you to then do is try giving a little more space around these thoughts and these narratives. So next time you notice a certain thought form coming up, let's say, oh, this is never going to end, rather than just going into the usual pattern and constricting, so let's say you feel a tightness around this thought form of, is this ever going to end, in your chest, what I want you to do is spend a bit of time creating more space around that thought form. So rather than resisting this idea that, is this ever going to end, and I've just got so many pains, and I've got this fatigue, and I'm just never going to be normal, just give that whole thought form a bit of space to breathe, realizing that this is just a thought form. It's simply a narrative. And allow that to have a bit of space, and allow it to, at its own pace, to resolve and to let go. And I just want you to notice what happens when you try that. And you can try that with all of the different thought forms and narratives that you have around chronic illness, and start to see the part that your mind is playing in your suffering, in the chronic illness journey. And I want to differentiate the fact that we're not blaming anyone for their illness, but it's actually quite empowering to know that you and your own mind have a role in the suffering that you're experiencing on the illness journey. And if you just spend some time experimenting with this, and letting go of a certain amount of resistance that you may be feeling around your illness and your suffering, you may find that your suffering starts to decrease a little bit, and some of the solutions start coming from you. So please send me a little love below in the comments field, and please give me some reactions, and also tell me how you went with trying out this exercise and seeing, did it make any difference to you with regard to the suffering you're experiencing. Thank you, and have a great evening.